Friedrich Nietzsche swung a philosophical hammer that shattered the very foundations of Western civilization and birthed the terrifying concept of the overman. We are not dealing with a treatise on ethics. We are facing a controlled demolition of the very foundations of Western civilization. It constitutes Friedrich Nietzsche's most systematic and devastating attack on traditional morality, an attempt to decipher the sickly provenance of our most sacred values. Far from the academic philosophy that builds systems, Nietzsche wields the genealogical hammer. He uses it to conduct an archaeology of the moral conscience. He excavates beneath the monuments of good and evil until he finds the instinctual forces that erected them. These are resentment, internalized cruelty, and the will to power of the weak. This work is structured in 3 essays that strike like 3 successive blows. It does not seek to refute morality, but to diagnose its symptoms. His radical question is not what should I do, but what has made me who I am. Nietzsche drags us on a journey into the underworld of the European psyche. He shows how goodness was born from spiritualized hatred, how guilt came from primitive creditor logic, and how the ascetic ideal emerged from a fear of life. Each moral concept reveals its sordid descent when subjected to the genealogical magnifying glass. But genealogy is not an end in itself. It is the necessary prologue for the great transvaluation, the possibility of creating new values from the Dionysian affirmation of existence. By unmasking the past, Nietzsche frees us for the future, a future where the overman, having overcome herd morality, can dance over the abyss and say yes to life in its terrible and glorious fullness. This is not a philosophy to preserve values, but to create them, not to console, but to awaken. Genealogy is, ultimately, the art of thinking dangerously. The general intention of this work is to execute a radical critique, not a refutation, but a dissection of Western morality, understood not as a system of eternal principles, but as a symptom, a historical phenomenon rooted in the darkest struggles of power and life. Nietzsche does not ask whether an action is good or bad, according to a given code. His genealogical hammer strikes the very table of values to ask for its descent. His goal is to demonstrate that what we call morality is not the voice of God, nor is it the dictate of reason. It is the sedimentation of resentments, triumphs, and strategies of domination that have forgotten themselves, hardening into the appearance of the unquestionable. The central question that articulates the 3 essays is simple in its formulation but devastating in its implications. Where do our moral values come from? This interrogation does not seek a chronological starting point, but an emergence. It is about tracing the line of forces that turned weakness into goodness, strength into wickedness, asceticism into virtue, and the will to power into sin. Nietzsche invites us on an archaeological journey, not toward external ruins, but toward the underground of our own moral conscience, to exhume the instincts, pains, and vengeances that petrified into the foundations of what we now consider good. The genealogical method, therefore, is not historical in the conventional sense. It is a psychology of the depths applied to culture. Its gesture consists of making the familiar strange, showing that the moral ground we walk on is not solid rock, but the result of a spiritual war lasting millennia, whose battles were fought inside the human soul before being fixed on tables of law. In doing so, Nietzsche not only questions morality, he questions man himself, the moral man, as his most successful and perhaps sickliest product. Genealogy is the art of unmasking idols, and this book is its sharpest manifesto. Nietzsche introduces a fundamental fracture in the understanding of morality here. There is not one morality, but 2 radically different structures of valuation. They emerged from opposing existential conditions: master morality and slave morality. This distinction is not sociological, but psycho-ontological. It defines 2 ways of being in the world, 2 ways of experiencing life and affirming value. Master morality is born from fullness, from an excess of strength. For the master, the warrior, aristocrat, the poet, the good is synonymous with the noble, the powerful, that which is capable of affirming itself without the need for comparison. His goodness is a spontaneous consequence of his way of being. He acts from abundance. And his morality is a resounding yes to life, to hierarchy, to beauty, and to difference. The bad is simply the plebeian, the weak, that which fails to reach his height. It is not hatred, but contempt. Not resentment, but a pathos of distance. His valuation is active, creative, and is expressed in the action itself, not in the reaction. Faced with it, slave morality arises from impotence, from ressentiment. For the slave, the oppressed, the one incapable of acting, the master and his qualities are initially perceived as a threat. Strength, pride, and health are seen as evil. But being unable to defeat him on the plane of action, the slave executes the most decisive spiritual revolt in history. He redefines the good as the opposite of what the master represents. Thus, weakness becomes goodness, humility becomes virtue, the inability to take revenge becomes forgiveness, and necessity becomes merit. This morality is not active, but reactive. Its good is not an original affirmation, but a negation of the other, a no disguised as virtue. It is the imaginary revenge of the impotent. A revenge that, by triumphing historically, has made us call goodness today what began as spiritualized rancor. This dialectic is not just an event of the past. For Nietzsche, Western culture is the result of the gradual triumph of slave morality, embodied above all in Judeo-Christianity, over master morality. What we understand today by moral conscience carries at its core the imprint of this triumphant resentment, which has managed to present its own values not as an option, but as morality itself. Genealogy is, therefore, the attempt to awaken from this spell, to remember that there was, and could be again, a way to value life from affirmation and not from negation. Nietzsche's genealogical method constitutes a Copernican revolution in moral philosophy. It does not ask what values are, but where they come from. It does not investigate their timeless essence, but their historical and psychological descent. It is an art of suspicion applied to the most sacred concepts, an archaeology of conscience that excavates beneath the monuments of morality to find the instinctual forces that erected them. Genealogy operates under a fundamental principle. The descent of a concept is not pure, but is contaminated by struggle, suffering, and the will to power. What presents itself today as universal and disinterested had a contingent, earthly, and often violent beginning. This method explicitly rejects the search for a pure metaphysical origin, to concentrate on the emergence in conflict and the descent from a material and instinctive base. It is not about finding a noble foundational moment, but about tracing the low descent of our highest ideals. Christian goodness, for example, was not born from divine revelation, but from the resentment of the Jews against the Roman aristocracy. Justice did not emerge from a social contract, but from the creditor-debtor relationship and the cruelty that accompanied it. Genealogy shows that behind every table of values there is a history of bodies, of tamed instincts, of inflicted sufferings, and of struggles for interpretation. Psychologically, the method explores how certain effects have been internalized. Resentment, cruelty, directed against oneself, and fear have taken shape to form what we call moral conscience. Bad conscience, far from being a divine voice, is for Nietzsche the result of man's natural instincts. Being prevented from discharging outward by civilization, they turned against the individual himself. This inward turn created a psychic depth, a soul, where before there was only an economy of impulses. Genealogy is therefore a diagnosis. By showing the descent of our values, it also reveals the sickness of the human animal. That being who, in order to live in society, had to become sick with morality. Its purpose is not nihilistic, but therapeutic. Only by knowing the descent of our values can we overcome their spell and create new values, more faithful to life. Ressentiment is not for Nietzsche a simple passing grudge. It is the fundamental metaphysical event that gestated the morality of the West. It is a negative force that possesses a perverse creative power, the capacity to generate values from its own incapacity. The slave, lacking the power to act, to respond with deeds to the oppression of the master, does not remain inactive. His spirit, prevented from discharging outward, turns inward and ferments. This fermentation is the breeding ground of ressentiment, a psychic poison that cannot exhaust itself in immediate revenge. and which, therefore, spiritualizes itself, becomes lasting and methodical. Its mechanism is triple and lethal. First, it operates an imaginary inversion of values. The strength, health, and joy of the master, which were initially experienced as superior and therefore painful for the slave, are declared evil. Second, it reattributes the source of value. The good is no longer what the master is, but what the slave decides is good in opposition to him. Humility, compassion, patience. This is not an act of self-affirmation, but of reactive negation. Its yes is parasitic on a primordial no. Third, ressentiment universalizes itself as morality. What was born as the revenge of a specific group of impotent people is later presented as cosmic law, as the will of God, as pure reason. In this way, the reactive judgment of the weak manages to triumph over the action of the strong, not by force, but by the most successful spiritual intoxication in history. This creative force is therefore sterile at its root. It is not born from abundance, but from lack. It does not celebrate life, but denies it at its very source. The genius of ressentiment consisted in disguising this negation of life under the mantle of virtue, in making all of humanity admire as a supreme ideal what began as the cunning of impotent hatred. Thus, slave morality is not simply an alternative ethics. It is the symptom of a life that, unable to affirm itself, takes revenge on everything that can. Its legacy is what Nietzsche diagnoses as modern nihilism, a world where supreme values have devalued themselves, because they were built from the beginning on the poisoned soil of negation. Christianity represents for Nietzsche the culmination and metaphysical consolidation of slave morality. It was not its inventor. Its roots sink into the Jewish priestly rebellion against the aristocratic order, but it was its most effective and universal vehicle of propagation. Its genius lay in taking the inversion of values operated by ressentiment and elevating it to the category of a divine, eternal, and transcendent order, where master morality celebrated strength, health, and earthly affirmation. On earth as it is in heaven, Christianity executed a radical transvaluation. The poor in spirit would inherit the earth. The meek would be called children of God, and weakness became holiness. What the slave called evil, strength, pride, sensuality, was systematically demonized as sin, while his own reactive virtues, humility, obedience, chastity, were sacralized as the path of salvation. This was not a simple substitution of values, but a militarization of ressentiment. The cross was erected as the banner of a spiritual war against everything that affirmed life in its natural fullness. The mechanism was triple. First, it internalized guilt. By declaring human nature fallen and sinful, it turned life itself into an unpayable debt to God, generating bad conscience as a chronic suffering of the soul. Second, it eternalized compensation. By postulating an otherworldly kingdom, it radically devalued earthly existence. It displaced all reward even further to the unverifiable beyond, making resignation in this world a virtue. Third, it universalized compassion. By proclaiming love for one's neighbor as supreme law, it leveled all men into a shared mediocrity, weakening the instincts of selection and excellence that characterize every ascending culture. Thus, Christianity not only inverted values, but poisoned the very source of value, by making the negation of life, asceticism, the rejection of the body, and the distrust of instincts the highest ideal. It metaphysically consecrated the revenge of the slave against everything that is powerful, healthy, and affirmative. Its historical triumph, according to Nietzsche, marks the beginning of the decline of the West, the moment when humanity began to worship as divine that which denies it, and to persecute as evil that which strengthens it. The death of God, announced by Nietzsche, is not a celebration, but the diagnosis of the nihilistic consequences of having lived too long under values that, in their origin, were the consecration of hatred against life. Now, the second essay takes a turn toward the underground of the Western psyche, the genealogy of the feeling of guilt. Nietzsche dismantles the notion that guilt is a natural response to a moral failing. On the contrary, he traces it back to a much more crude and material descent. the primary economic relationship of debtor and creditor. In archaic societies, the one who broke a promise or caused damage became a debtor. Compensation was not symbolic, but physical. The body of the debtor was the ultimate guarantee of payment, and the creditor had the right, even the pleasure, of inflicting suffering as a way of balancing the scales. Pain thus became a currency, a way to settle a debt. This economic mechanism was gradually internalized. As society grew and power centralized, the community established itself as the supreme creditor. Prohibitions and obligations multiplied, and the inability to fulfill them generated a perpetual debt to the founding ancestors, then to the divinity. Here is where the decisive transformation occurs. The unpayable debt to God is reinterpreted as guilt. The German word means both guilt and debt at the same time. Cruelty, which used to be discharged upon the body of the debtor, can no longer be exercised freely in a regulated society. It turns against the individual himself. Thus, bad conscience is born. The instinct of cruelty directed inward, creating a psychic space where man accuses, judges, and torments himself. Far from being a trait of spiritual elevation, bad conscience is for Nietzsche the sickness of the human animal, forced to live in society and to repress his most primary instincts. Christianity took this process to its extreme by declaring man an insolvent debtor due to original sin, an infinite debt that could only be settled with the suffering and death of God himself. Thus, guilt became constitutive of the human condition, a chronic malaise that man carries inside as the legacy of an ancestral cruelty that he can no longer exercise on others, and which he therefore exercises on himself. The genealogy of guilt thus reveals that the sanctuary of moral conscience was built on the foundations of an internalized torture chamber. The decisive turn in the genealogy of guilt occurs when the crudely material relationship of debtor and creditor undergoes a metaphysical transubstantiation. In primitive societies, the debt was to the tribe, to the founding ancestors, to whom one owed one's very existence and the social order. But, as the community strengthens and perceives itself as a powerful entity, the figure of the primal creditor grows to the immeasurable. The ancestors are transfigured into gods, and the debt to them becomes colossal, unpayable with simple offerings or sacrifices. This is the soil from which the religious notion of guilt will sprout. Judeo-Christian monotheism takes this logic to its absolute extreme. Here, the creditor is no longer a tribal god, but the one God, creator of the universe and of life itself. The debt contracted with him is, by definition, infinite. Existence itself is a loan that can never be returned. Man is the insolvent debtor par excellence. At this point, the economic debt transforms irreversibly into moral guilt. The inability to pay is no longer experienced as a simple accounting imbalance, but as an existential stain, a radical flaw in being. Moral duty is born from this impossible-to-settle debt. Christianity perfects this mechanism with the doctrine of original sin. All of humanity is born in a state of infinite debt due to an ancestral fault. This hereditary guilt becomes the very substrate of the human condition. The cruelty that in the primitive creditor relationship was discharged upon the body of the debtor is now directed by man against his own soul in the form of remorse, asceticism, and spiritual self-flagellation. The genius of Christianity was to institutionalize this feeling of infinite guilt and at the same time offer the solution on the same plane. An act of supreme cruelty, the sacrifice of God himself, as symbolic payment of a debt that, nevertheless, continues to demand the perpetual contrition of the believer. Thus, Western morality is founded on the paradox of a man who is both irrevocable debtor and his own executioner, trapped in an economy of salvation that perpetuates the logic of the guilt it claims to redeem. The birth of what we call conscience is not, for Nietzsche, the awakening of a divine spark, but the result of a violent instinctual repression. Primitive man, an animal among animals, possessed an economy of impulses directed outward: hunting, aggression, mating, fleeing. But life in a community, that primordial state, demanded the internalization of these forces. Seeing their natural paths of discharge blocked, the instincts could not extinguish themselves. They turned inward. This forced turn, this internalization of man, created a psychic depth for the first time. The energy that was previously spent in action was now concentrated in an interior space, giving rise to what we know as the soul. Moral conscience, therefore, is born as an organ of self-surveillance, a pathological substitute for direct action. Far from being a sign of superiority, it is the mark of a sick animal, split from its own instincts and forced to live at war with itself. From this repression, however, arises one of humanity's most paradoxical conquests, the animal of promises. This is the man who has learned to be calculable, regular, and necessary. Society requires predictable individuals, capable of making long-term obligations and fulfilling them. For this, it was necessary to burn memory into the flesh, to make man a being who does not forget his word. This memory of the will was not achieved through reason, but through pain. Brutal punishments, sacrificial rituals, and indelible marks taught man to remember his promises, to feel bound by his own saying. Cruelty was the wet nurse of responsibility. Thus, the animal of promises is a creature with two faces. On the one hand, he represents a tremendous cultural achievement, the capacity to project oneself into the future, to create alliances, and to exercise sovereignty over oneself. It is the condition of possibility for justice, law, and higher culture. But on the other hand, he is the product of a foundational self-violence. His freedom to promise was built upon the tyranny of a conscience that reminds him at every moment of the debt contracted. The responsible man is, at the same time, the guilty man. This figure embodies the central paradox of civilization, the elevation of man through the systematic repression of what is most vital in him. Genealogy thus shows that our greatest pride, conscience, and responsibility carries at its core the scar of an ancestral cruelty directed against life itself. The third essay tackles the deepest enigma, not why man suffers, but why he seeks suffering, why he embraces ideals that deny life, the ascetic ideal. That will to negation, to poverty, to chastity, and to humility represents for Nietzsche the most refined and dangerous form of the will to power of the sick man. Far from being a simple renunciation, it is a tool of interpretation and domination. Its primary function is to give meaning to suffering, and therein lies its hypnotic power. Faced with purposeless pain, the ascetic ideal responds. You have a meaning. You are a test, a deserved punishment, a path of purification. This reinterpretation converts impotence into will, weakness into choice, and suffering into merit. It is the last resort of a will that, unable to affirm life, prefers to affirm its negation rather than affirm nothing at all. The figure of the ascetic priest is the genius who channels this mechanism. He does not invent suffering, but he does invent its meaning. By diagnosing guilt as the cause of pain, he offers a clear enemy, the sinful self, natural instincts, the body. The solution he proposes is a technique of self-annihilation, the systematic repression of everything that is vital. Thus the priest establishes himself as a doctor of the soul, but his cure is the sickness itself taken to its paroxysm. By directing the ressentiment of the herd against life itself, against this world in the name of a superior one, he consolidates his power and grants the weak the intoxicating sensation of being, thanks to their renunciation, better than the strong who enjoy existence. But the ascetic ideal does not die with faith in God. Nietzsche discovers its modern face in positivist science, in art for art's sake, and even in metaphysics without God. Wherever life is denied in the name of a beyond, be it celestial or earthly, there dwells the ascetic ideal. The scientist who sacrifices everything on the altar of objective truth repeats the gesture of the monk. He despises the present in the name of a hypothetical future. The function remains intact, to provide a meaning that preserves life from nihilism, even if that meaning is, deep down, a condemnation of life. The ascetic ideal is, therefore, the final paradox, the will to nothingness, which disguises itself as supreme meaning. So that man, that sick animal, can continue to want something, even if that something is his own negation. The ascetic ideal does not represent the absence of will, but its most twisted and brilliant expression, the will to power of the weak. When natural instincts cannot discharge outward, they turn against themselves in an act of self-negation, which, paradoxically, affirms a form of domination. The ascetic does not lack power. He exercises a fierce power over his own body, his desires, and his mind. His renunciation is a gigantic affirmation of the will, but directed toward nothingness. It is the Pyrrhic victory of the spirit over life, a triumph that ensures the survival of the sick man at the price of declaring war on everything that is healthy, instinctive, and affirmative. This logic is not limited to the monastery. Nietzsche extends his critique to three pillars of modern culture that, by adopting the ascetic ideal, betray their true mission. Science, when it sets itself up in search of an objective truth, disconnected from life, repeats the gesture of the priest. It despises the sensible world in the name of a world of abstract laws, and the researcher becomes a martyr of the laboratory, denying his corporeality for the sake of a knowledge that ultimately devalues concrete existence. Art, when it falls into art for art's sake, embraces an aestheticizing form of asceticism. By claiming absolute autonomy and unconcern for life, it turns against its Dionysian essence, which is a celebration of existence, and it takes refuge in mere form, in refined but empty technique, a decadent luxury that flees from commitment to the real, and philosophy, the most treacherous of all. When it becomes mere metaphysical speculation or sterile linguistic analysis, it abandons its task of creating values and legislating over life. The ascetic philosopher despises this world in the name of concepts, systems, or language games, repeating the old priestly hatred against the immediate and the corporeal. In all three cases, the ascetic ideal ensures its survival by mutating. It no longer needs God, truth, pure beauty, or the concept are enough for it to keep man at war against his own nature, thus perpetuating the great sickness of the West. The will, which incapable of affirming life, prefers to affirm its negation rather than disappear. The confrontation with Arthur Schopenhauer is not a secondary polemic, it is the beating heart of the third essay. Schopenhauer represents the logical and most honest conclusion of the ascetic ideal. If life is essentially suffering, and the will is a blind and painful force, the only rational way out is the negation of the will to live. His philosophy is a monumental no to life, a glorification of resignation, nirvana, and the annihilation of desires. For Schopenhauer, the genius and the saint are those who understand that it is best not to want, and his universal compassion is born from the recognition that we all share the same existential curse. This metaphysical pessimism is, for Nietzsche, the most dangerous form of the ascetic ideal, because it dresses up as profound truth what is nothing more than the supreme expression of vital exhaustion. Against this Schopenhauerian no, Nietzsche opposes the Dionysian yes. Dionysus is not the god of empty debauchery, but of the tragic affirmation of life, including its pain, its cruelty, and its apparent meaninglessness. Where Schopenhauer sees a curse that must be denied, Nietzsche sees a play of creative and destructive forces that must be loved in its entirety. The Dionysian yes does not ignore suffering. It embraces it as a necessary part of existence and transfigures it through art, dance, and laughter. It is the will to power in its most exuberant state, a force that does not flee from life, but wants it exactly as it is, eternally, in an eternal return of the same. This opposition defines Nietzsche's ultimate project. It is not about substituting one ideal for another, but about carrying out a radical transvaluation, changing the sign of existence itself. The ascetic ideal, embodied by Schopenhauer, says, "Life is worthless. To redeem oneself is to escape from it." The Dionysian yes responds, "Life is the only value, and to redeem it is to love it unconditionally, without what for, without a beyond." The genealogy of morality thus leads to a crossroads. Either we persist in the morality of ressentiment and its ideal of negation, or we dare the innocence of becoming, to be those philosophers of the future who, free from guilt, can finally dance over the abyss and say yes to life, even in its deepest horror. The death of God demands this birth. That of the overman who, having overcome asceticism, is capable of wanting life so intensely that he would desire its eternal return. Nietzschean genealogy is not simply a historical method. It is an epistemological earthquake that inaugurates a new modality of thinking compared to traditional philosophy, which sought timeless essences and pure foundations. Genealogy stands as an archaeology of values. Its task is not to define what is good, but to exhume the conditions of emergence that made it possible for certain valuations to establish themselves as unquestionable. It operates under the principle that no value is original. They are all the result of struggles, sufferings, and strategies of power that have been forgotten. The genealogist is a miner of consciousness who goes down into the galleries of the past, not to find a foundation, but to show that the foundation itself is a shifting construction. This gesture turns philosophy into an art of systematic suspicion. Where metaphysics saw necessity, genealogy discovers contingency. Where morality saw altruism, it detects resentment. Where religion saw devotion, it finds fear and the will to dominate. In doing so, it does not destroy values, but denaturalizes them, showing that their authority does not come from a divine or rational mandate, but from a history of conflicting forces. This decentering is liberating. If values were not always this way, they can be otherwise. The incendiary wake of Nietzschean genealogy reaches its maximum resonance in the thought of the 20th century. Michel Foucault, his most lucid heir, transfers the method from the realm of moral values to that of institutions and knowledge. Where Nietzsche traced the origin of good and evil, Foucault excavates in penal, medical, and sexual systems to show how power does not repress, but produces forms of subjectivity. His analysis of biopolitics and disciplinary mechanisms is the genealogical application to the social body, a demonstration that the individual himself is the result of historical techniques of domination. Gilles Deleuze, for his part, radicalizes the will to power as a creative and differential force, freeing it from any biologicist reading. For Deleuze, genealogy is the art of mapping the forces that compose the real, a nomadic thought that escapes fixed categories. Together, Foucault and Deleuze, and with them the postmodern current, turn genealogical suspicion into the privileged instrument to demolish the grand narratives of modernity, showing that behind reason, progress, or liberation hide microphysics of power and wills to truth. This legacy is enriched with a crucial distinction: the comparison between Nietzsche and Charles Darwin. Both thinkers share a profoundly historical and non-teleological vision of phenomena. However, their paths diverge radically. Darwin traces the biological evolution of species, a blind process of variation, natural selection, and adaptation to the environment. Where the survival of the fittest is defined by reproductive efficiency, morality, in this framework, could be explained as an adaptive mechanism of social cooperation. Nietzsche, on the other hand, proposes a moral evolution of values, a conscious and conflicting process of interpretive struggles, where what is at stake is not physical survival, but meaning, selection. Here, it is not natural, but spiritual. It does not operate on bodies, but on tables of values. For Nietzsche, man is not the culminating point of Darwinian evolution, but an unfinished animal, a bridge to the overman, whose fitness is not measured by his adaptation to the environment, but by his capacity to create new values that affirm life beyond mere preservation. While Darwin explains how man came to be what he is, Nietzsche asks how he can overcome himself. Genealogy is, in this sense, the science of that overcoming, the history of how man has interpreted his own value, and the prehistory of how he could, finally, give himself his own value. The Nietzschean critique of modern progress constitutes a hammer blow to the foundations of Western complacency, where his era saw a linear advance toward freedom, equality, and general happiness. Nietzsche detects a fictional narrative that masks a much darker reality: the leveling of man, the flattening of everything exceptional in the name of the security and well-being of the herd. Progress, in its modern formulation, is nothing more than the secularization of the ascetic ideal, the promise of a redemptive future that justifies the sacrifice of the present, and above all, the domestication of vital instincts. Faith in progress is the new religion of the mediocre man, Who prefers comfort to greatness and stability to creative risk? This critique intertwines with his devastating revision of humanism. For Nietzsche, modern humanism, with its cult of the abstract man, its universal rights, and its indiscriminate compassion, is the hypocritical culmination of slave morality. By erecting human dignity as the supreme value, it does nothing but consecrate mediocrity, protect weakness, and hinder the emergence of superior human types. Universal compassion, far from being virtuous, is an instrument of decline. It weakens both the one who receives it and the one who exercises it, perpetuating the sickness instead of allowing the natural selection of the strongest. Humanism is the form that resentment takes when it dresses up as philanthropy. It is the hatred of everything that overflows the common measure, disguised as love for one's neighbor. Together, faith in progress and humanistic ethics constitute the two pillars of what Nietzsche denounces as the definitive domestication of the human animal. They have created a society where the best is no longer the most noble or powerful, but the most harmless, the most adapted to life in a herd. This process, far from being a liberation, is a form of passive nihilism, a life that no longer wants anything beyond its own preservation and comfort. Faced with this vision, Nietzsche opposes the need for a beyond man, for a transvaluation that places back in the center not the survival of the weakest, but the affirmation of the strongest. Not progress toward uniformity, but the will to create exceptions that justify the existence of the species. Genealogy, by revealing the sickly origins of these ideals, does not seek to destroy civilization, but to save it from its own will to negation. The Nietzschean vital proposal is not exhausted in critique. It is a call to a radical existential transformation. Overcoming the morality of ressentiment does not mean adopting a new table of precepts, but carrying out a transvaluation of all values, which radically eradicates the sickness of guilt and negation. It implies a return to the Dionysian spirit prior to the Socratic split, that primordial will that affirmed life in its totality, including pain, destruction, and chaos, as necessary parts of the eternal creative game. Where the ascetic sees a sinful world that must be denied, the Dionysian spirit sees an aesthetic phenomenon that must be loved unconditionally. This overcoming demands unlearning millennia of moral auto-intoxication, evicting the priest who dwells in our conscience and recovering the innocence of becoming, the capacity to live without the metaphysical need to blame something or someone for the simple fact of existing. This path of overcoming necessarily leads to two key figures: the overman and the eternal return. The overman is not a moral ideal, nor a guaranteed evolutionary destiny, but the possibility of a human type that has transcended herd morality. He is the being capable of creating his own values from the abundance of his will to power, who accepts the earth as his only kingdom and celebrates his existence without the need for otherworldly consolations. He is not a despot, but an artist of himself, whose goodness is born from fullness and not from renunciation. In parallel, the doctrine of the eternal return acts as the supreme test for this new spirit. The idea that all existence will repeat itself infinitely in identical succession. Only the one who can desire that his life repeat itself eternally, with every pain and every joy, has truly overcome resentment, and has achieved absolute Dionysian affirmation. The genealogy of morality thus reveals its final purpose. It is not a mere historical investigation, but the necessary diagnosis for a future cure. By showing that morality was an interpretation, the interpretation of the weak, Nietzsche frees the space for a new interpretation to arise. That of the Dionysian spirit who, having killed God and buried modern man, can finally dance over the ruins of idols and say yes to life in its mysterious and terrible fullness. This rebirth is not a return to the past, but the creation of a future, where the will to power, instead of denying itself, will become art, thought, and a form of existence that justifies, finally, the pain of millennia. The overman is not a moral ideal, nor a guaranteed evolutionary destiny, but the possibility of a human type that has transcended herd morality. He is the being capable of creating his own values, from the abundance of his will to power, who accepts the earth as his only kingdom and celebrates his existence without the need for otherworldly consolations. He is not a despot, but an artist of himself, whose goodness is born from fullness and not from renunciation. In parallel, the doctrine of the eternal return, the idea that all existence will repeat itself infinitely in identical succession, acts as the supreme test for this new spirit. Only the one who can desire that his life repeat itself eternally, with every pain and every joy, has truly overcome ressentiment and has achieved absolute Dionysian affirmation. The genealogy of morality thus reveals its final purpose. It is not a mere historical investigation, but the necessary diagnosis for a future cure. By showing that morality was an interpretation, the interpretation of the weak, Nietzsche frees the space for a new interpretation to arise, that of the Dionysian spirit, who, having killed God and buried modern man, can finally dance over the ruins of idols and say yes to life in its mysterious and terrible fullness. This rebirth is not a return to the past, but the creation of a future where the will to power, instead of denying itself, will become art, in thought, and in a form of existence that justifies, finally, the pain of millennia. The eternal return is not a cosmological theory, but the supreme test for the liberated spirit. Nietzsche presents it as the most abysmal mental experiment. What would happen if a demon revealed to you that this life, with every tiny detail and every agony, will repeat itself infinitely, without any variation? The reaction to this idea divides men more radically than any morality. The man of ressentiment, burdened with guilt, regrets, and desires for another world, would collapse before the horror of a condemnation without redemption. But the Dionysian spirit, the one who has overcome slave morality, would exult. For him, the eternal return is the definitive consecration of amor fati, the love of fate. Not a stoic resignation, but an affirmative ecstasy that embraces every fragment of existence as necessary and precious. This doctrine is the metaphysical antidote against ressentiment, while the morality of the priest rested on the promise of a beyond that would redeem the sufferings of this world. The eternal return cancels all transcendence. There is no final judgment, only this instant repeated eternally. Thus, it forces man to reconcile radically with immanence. Either he curses himself for all eternity, or he learns to love his existence to the point of desiring its infinite repetition. The overman is precisely the one who passes this test, the one who can say yes, not only to the sublime, but also to the terrible, not only to his triumphs, but also to his failures, because he understands that everything was necessary to become what he is. The eternal return thus converts life into a work of art whose perfection is measured by the fullness of its affirmation. Every instant acquires an absolute weight. There are no longer banal actions, since everything is eternalized. This idea does not invite passivity, but an extreme creative responsibility. To live in such a way that one is willing to repeat every choice infinite times is the maximum expression of the will to power converted into conscious joy. By embracing the eternal return, man ceases to be a bridge toward the overman to become his prelude, a being who, by loving his destiny, transforms into the artist and sculptor of himself, forging a soul strong enough to carry the beauty and the horror of being eternal. The culmination of the Nietzschean project does not reside in critique, but in creation. After demolishing the idols of Western morality, the supreme task rises, to create new values beyond good and evil. This beyond is not a space of amoral indifference, but the territory of the legislating autonomy of the free spirit. It implies overcoming the reactive dialectic that opposes good and bad, to generate valuations from vital abundance, from a will to power that no longer needs to deny in order to affirm itself. The new values will not be universal, but singular. They will not claim to obligate everyone, but to express the natural hierarchy of forces. Their criterion will not be utility for the herd, but the affirmative power they deploy. If they intensify life, if they expand the capacity to feel, create, and love destiny, this creative act is the essence of the overman, not a redeemer, but a child, in a metaphorical sense. The one who can start a new game because he has overcome the ressentiment of the no and the obedience of the reactive yes. The Nietzschean child possesses the innocence of becoming to value without guilt. To name the world as if it were the first time, freed from the weight of moral tradition. His values are not written on stone tablets, but are embodied in ways of life, in gestures, in works of art, and in modes of thought that celebrate experimentation and risk. They are earthly values, rooted in physis, that convert existence into a self-referential work of art. Genealogy then reveals its ultimate secret. By showing that all values were created, it gives us back the freedom and the responsibility to create our own. The beyond good and evil is not a nihilistic void, but the space of spiritual maturity where man, after having killed God and buried the morality of the herd, establishes himself finally as the poet of his own existence. The task is no longer to obey or rebel, but to legislate, to give shape to a world where life, in its tragic and Dionysian fullness, is the supreme value and the measure of all values.